Hello, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Küstenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping your futures. Now, have you ever wondered what the future of housing looks for the younger generations, for Gen Z? We spend a lot of time talking about the future and demographics, but right now, a lot of Australians seem to be they feel they're locked out of the property market. They're priced out, they're disillusioned, they're pessimistic about their financial futures. But what if the story isn't all doom and gloom? So if you're curious about what the housing market may look like in, let's say, 10 years' time, and how demographics and economic forces could tilt things in Gen Z's favour, this is a conversation you won't want to miss. So whether you're a parent, whether you're a Gen Z or generations before or after them, if you're a business owner, I think this episode is going to be very valuable for you, because how the Gen Zs are going to live and what they're going to do is going to be critical for our future. So, Simon, I'd like to explore something that you wrote in an article in The Australian. You write every week in the New Daily that is not behind a paywall, so people can get your information, and regularly in The Australian, which isn't a paywall but definitely worth reading. So let's have a talk about how Gen Z's future might not be as bleak as some of them feel.
Yeah, we first might need to remind folks who Gen Z are in this context. So
Please.
We're calling people born between 2000 and 2017. And so these are essentially all the grads that you're getting through your door right now as a business and for the next decade and a half. That's Gen Z. And at the moment, when we look at data about their mental health, for example, this points a truly bleak picture. This is the most pessimistic, misanthropic generation out there to ever walk the Australian continent, to be honest. And I would argue it has to do with their stage in history, because they were the first generation that we gave smartphones to as soon as they hit their formative years, early teenage years. And in generational research, we always say whatever happens in your formative years, that changes your worldview forever. And we bombarded this generation with social media, with global news, and it changes the stories they tell about themselves. We see particularly young women have very, very poor mental health figures, and it has to do with constant, unrealistic beauty standards that you're being exposed to, and beauty standards being physical beauty standards, but also the quality of life standards, because you are constantly consuming on visual social media, on TikTok, on Instagram, about how wonderful the life of your peers or assumed peers is. You're looking at this phone while you are on the loo, on the couch. This is not very exciting then. So you always feel that you are in a worse position than the other people. So that makes you feel very bad about yourselves. This has severe mental health impacts. This is significantly worse for women than it is for men, which doesn't need to be a good sign for men, to be honest, because we've seen male suicide rates go up and up and up. And I would argue that male suicides are the ultimate expression of poor mental health. And that to me suggests that we simply have an underdiagnosis of poor mental health in particularly young men. So there is lots of catch up to do. So whenever you go and see a poster, an advertisement for Beyond Blue, for Movember, there is real need for those services in Australia for our young people. And I couldn't support them more. I'm a big fan of both institutions. They fill a need in the market. So big support here.
When you think about it, Simon, there is all this terrible news. I can understand climate change is going to kill us. Species are going to become extinct. Unjust wars around the world wherever you look. Work is meaningless. God is dead, not around. Housing is going to be unaffordable. So I can understand why they're concerned. But as you and mental health issues, as you said, I kept reading your article in The Australian, you actually changed my view and thought maybe it's not that bad ahead anyway. So where did you come up with those thoughts?
This is the idea of seeing just how much they suffer and how much pessimistic they are about the world. So I figured, what is their outlook? Should they be pessimistic? Do we have maybe a couple of things that give them reason to be hopeful? And so I tried to look for those data sets. And there is quite a bit to unearth here. First and foremost, Gen Z will benefit from being a small generation. They're the kids of Gen X, which is a famously small generation. The people born in the 60s and 70s when the contraceptive pill kept birth rates nice and low. So now they make a small generation of Gen Z. And Gen Z is now entering the world of work right now when we don't have enough workers, when the employers are desperate for staff. So that's a good position, isn't it? Because
Yes.
ultimately what Gen Zs now can do is they can ask for concessions. They can ask for higher wages, for example. They can ask for better working conditions, whatever it is. So that's a good starting point for your career.
I guess it's a period of low unemployment, so there is a level of job security and choices that other previous generations didn't have.
Exactly. And ultimately, you start your career on a relatively elevated wage. That means for the rest of your career, your wage increases come on a relatively high basis. So your wealth creation journey as a generation as a whole should be okay. Yes, there are unknowns in the future. We talk about what exactly will AI do with our wage structures in this country. We'll put this to the side for now, but we say just those demographic drivers suggest relatively decent wage growth for these for this whole generation. You go like, okay, that's cool. That's probably rather beneficial. I'll take that win. But you would then go, especially now in the next 10 years, this is lasting because remember, we retire the baby boomers. So there will be plenty of jobs that come onto the market. These young Gen Zs, of course, they won't take the baby boomer senior jobs. But this is a trickle down thing because we then put Gen Xers in charge. We then push millennials into middle management, and there will be plenty of junior positions out there that will still be needed, that employers will be relatively desperate to fill. So that's pretty nice. Good starting point on the job front here for Gen Z. Then, of course, might need to look at something like gender equality. This is something very important, equality for this young generation. And I am a very, very big optimist about gender equality. I would predict that gender equality will be completely a thing of the past in somewhere around 15 to 18 years. We already see that there's no gender pay gap whatsoever for anyone under the age of 50, as long as they are not a parent. We already don't discriminate based on gender anymore. We discriminate based on primary caregiving. And sure, women are the primary caregivers, but now that young women, are outperforming men on all levels of education, now that there are more and more highly educated women that out earn their peers, their male peers. So that closes the gender pay gap, and they will still get married, those women, sooner or later. And more and more of those women will have partners, male partners, that earn less money. And when it then comes to returning back to the office, returning to work, the higher income earner, which in those cases would be the woman, will return at a higher capacity than the lower income earner. That completely closes the gender pay gap. So I'd be utterly surprised if by the 2040s we'll still have a gender pay gap.
Well,
In
we're
the
talking about
UK,
Gen Zs, and the older ones are 25 at the moment. So they're not at family formation age yet, and they're probably not ready to buy a home. As we've discussed in previous episodes of Demographics Decoded, they're putting down their roots into a home and family later in life. So in 10 years' time or so, when the oldest ones start to move into family formation stage or buying a home. I've read in your article, you think their prospects are going to be better off because they've got more income, and housing may be a little bit proportionate, not cheaper in real dollar values, but proportionately a bit easier to get into.
exactly. And the reason why housing should be a bit more easily accessible is that baby boomers die out of their homes at scale in about 10 years' time, which will, of course, be relatively nice and relatively
That sounds pretty morbid, Simon.
Oh, it's very morbid. It's very morbid, and selling this as a positive to our young generation is, of course, something that will absolutely delight our older listeners. I'm most certain. But that's some of the realities of life. Is that as you die, something happens with your wealth, something happens with the
Yes.
lot of land that you occupied, and it will be handed down through a couple of transactions into someone else's hands. And the relatively nice, relatively large homes of boomers, they will be too expensive for the young Gen Zs to purchase. Absolutely. But the millennials that are now moving to the urban fringe, because that's the only place where family-sized housing is available, they will then move to the baby boomer homes. They might have them subdivided into two townhouses or whatever, but they will move into the more desirable destinations or suburbs of our cities. Quite astonishing, isn't it? Because then Gen Zs will have relatively affordable houses on the urban fringe available just in time for when they need family-sized homes. So the timing aligns rather nicely for Gen Zs.
Well, it's also you suggested that the timing will be good for their wages outlook, won't it? Because the baby boomers are retiring, and so there'll be a shortage of jobs, and there'll also be millennials still leaving the workforce in the short term for parental leave. So they should have good incomes at a time that they're going to need to service loans.
Exactly. Gen Zs will continue to be in high demand on the workforce. That's pretty cool. And a couple of other demographic factors suggest that a bit more housing is made available. That's demographics at play. You could also look at policies at play and say, well, at the moment, are we writing housing policy that might be helpful in about a decade's time? And you would then look at something like build to rent, and we'd say, well, build to rent, of course, is meant to increase the rental stock by putting institutional money into the system. At the moment, it's mostly mom and dad landlords in Australia. And so you go, well, a bit more institutional money would be cool. That increases supply. And why wouldn't that happen? If this increases supply, it would drive down rents a bit. And so that means while you are, getting ready slowly for family formation stage as a Gen Z, your rents wouldn't increase as much as they have done for the millennial generation when they tried to wait to make babies. So I'd say Gen Z so far can be a bit more optimistic, not when they compare themselves to the fortunes of their own parents, but when they compare themselves to the fortunes of the generation just before them, the millennials.
Now, we've discussed some of these aspects in previous shows. So if we're going to just discuss something that you've heard before, please bear with us because we have so many new listeners and viewers to our show every week. We get tens of thousands of downloads. And so, by the way, if you don't currently subscribe to this show, just click the subscribe or follow button on whatever podcast or video app you're watching this on, listening to this on, so you get the ongoing information about the trend shaping your future each week. But Simon, we've discussed before how the middle suburbs are going to change as baby boomers' homes hit the market on scale. Will this actually help the Generation Zs or more the millennials that came before them?
Yeah, it depends a bit on what happens with the individual lot of land. So we will carry plenty of baby boomers out of quarter acre blocks. These are large blocks now in the middle suburbs. And will the family house be sold as is? Sometimes it will. Then it will be a very expensive property. But quite often the baby boomer home will be bulldozed and you will squeeze a couple of townhouses in there. And so all of a sudden you have on the individual dwelling, you have a cheaper housing product. But ultimately, of course, the seller makes more money because you have three townhouses and the three townhouses are worth more money than one big house. And so you go, yeah, so that would increase the density of the middle suburbs. And the middle suburbs are, of course, from a commuting perspective, very attractive because you are much, much closer to the inner city, where still most of the jobs will be located in the short term, much shorter commute than on the outskirts of town. So they will be desirable locations. That, of course, has severe impacts on how we change our cities. The middle suburbs will finally be densified. They fought off densification quite successfully for a long time, but the passing of the baby boomers will really push densification into those areas in the coming decade and a half.
So there'll be some opportunities for people to live there. And that's great. There's probably also going to continue to be government grants to help first home buyers into the market. There was when I bought my first home in the 70s, actually, there was, I think, a $4,000 first home owner grant, and then it became bigger and it's bigger again. And now you need smaller deposits. I'm not sure where it's going to stop. They're politically, I guess, favourable, but I know you're not a fan of first homeowner grants and you don't mince your words about that. What's the harm these policies are going to do?
So it's one of my favorite policies to get angry about because we are always talking a lot in the political world about making housing more affordable, which should mean you make it cheaper. But that's not it. First home buyer grants are nothing but meaning the government, you give 10, 20,000 bucks, whatever it is, to quite a few first home buyers and you say, spend it on your house. But you then secretly hope that these first home buyers aren't telling the market about it. But the market immediately learns this and it factors this additional wealth, this additional spending capacity into the market. So first home buyer grants only drive up house prices. There's not a single economist in this country, on this universe really, that would say that first home buyer grants drive down prices. So they drive prices up. So what we're doing here is we are wasting public money to drive up the value of the housing market. That is absolutely painful for the people that are not actively on the property ladder. We're talking about first home buyers. We're talking about renters. We talk about young people in general. So this is a policy that is harming the young population. And so, which is one of the reasons why the young voters are very, very cynical about housing policies of the big parties, because both parties are absolutely equally guilty of this. Housing is expensive in Australia by design. And this is something that the young people increasingly understand, increasingly resent it. And you see the first kind of bigger cultural movements taking place to counter this. Part of this is the YIMBY movement, the Yes in My Backyard movement, the movement of young urbanists who say they want more development right around them because they know that this drives down prices, that this drives down rents rather than up. And so they want this. So it's the first thing. And that's not really political, the YIMBY movement, so to speak, because it's not a party. There is the Greens as a political fringe party. They tightly associate with housing affordability, with low rents, and they try to win over young people. They overwhelmingly snatch their votes from the young cohort because they intuit a certain kind of pain point. And I would say that the two major parties aren't doing themselves any favors here. Because, of course, the big parties understand that the majority of voters own the home, have a mortgage on it, and they don't want to, disgruntle those owners. And so you just come up with policies that look like they make housing cheaper while they don't do the opposite. Well, they do the exact opposite. And first home buyer grants are one example. Your super for housing is the same, only worse, where you waste your own money rather than public money on driving up the asset price of this thing that you want to buy right now. That is insane. So these kind of policies must stop. And I hope that we'll have more calmer political leaders that actually slow the obvious madness in the system. It's hard enough to keep house prices reasonably affordable or to turn them back to reasonably affordable values. But then let's not actively drive them up with these kind of policies.
I guess the first home owners, first home buyers in the next 10 years are going to be helped by the bank of mum and dad like the current generation are. And as you've already said, they're going to have good job prospects and good income. But the other side of things is also tax. At the moment, the federal government's talking about changing the tax policies, re-looking at everything. I know that you've talked about a broader rebalancing of the tax that would make things fairer. What are your thoughts on that? Is Australia ready for this?
Oh, no, absolutely not. So when we talk about tax reform, we want to think about how we're taxing our people at the moment. So at the moment, the federal government gets over 50% of its money, of its tax income from income tax. And so all the while, we have this is called the dependency ratio. So we have an ever smaller workforce in comparison to the non-working cohorts, to the old people and the young people. And so then you go, oh no, that's unfortunate as a government. So, but because we need so much money from income tax, I have an idea. Let's just keep the tax brackets as is. And so inflation leads to bracket creep, where we now feel that the middle class of Australia, they feel like, why am I still feeling, I should feel richer, Maybe you cracked the top tax bracket. You earn over $180,000. You're part of the top tax bracket, and you still feel not all that rich because you pay a bucket load of money to tax, and all the while your cost of living goes up and up and up. But you need to keep the tax bracket creep alive as a government so that you get more income tax, which is also, by the way, why at the moment we're not looking at slowing down migration, because migration still adds to the income tax. So, and government needs to get money from somewhere. You could, of course, change this. You could say we want to minimize significantly income tax. Let's allow people to keep twice as much of their paycheck. Let's cut income tax in half. This would be very popular when you stand on a stage and you announce this policy. But you would then need to find other revenue streams. And we could then say, well, we'd increase GST, the goods and services tax. That means we do not tax your income, but we tax your consumption. And this would then, of course, mean that the rich people who consume a lot, that they would also have to pay more consumption tax. We ultimately, of course, would then think, well, sure, but it's hard to get rich in Australia, but it's easy to stay rich. And so you go, well, so maybe can we tax your wealth? And that becomes very, very difficult because wealth is hard to find. It's easy to hide. And so you go, well, maybe we could get rid of stamp duty, introduce a land tax. That's a way of taxing wealth that is easily discoverable because land just sits there, so you can't hide it. That's a possibility. But ultimately, what this would lead to is to more people hiding, storing their wealth in stuff that is invisible, art or something like this. It's like, this can't be quantified. When can it be taxed, and so forth? So they're accounting tricks of hiding wealth. These are ways that we could go down as a country. We could choose to reschedule how we tax our population. At the moment, there is no appetite for this whatsoever. You have a couple of economists, Sol Eslake in Tasmania, fantastic guy, ex-chief economist of ANZ, I think, talking about these things. But ultimately, it's a couple of independent economists to talk about this and no politicians.
Now, Simon, in your article in The Australian, you suggested we need fewer academics and more tradies, even proposing universal free TAFE. What was your logic behind that? How would this help Gen Zs in the term of housing affordability, which is really what we started this conversation about?
So we are sending more than half of our year 12s into university. And we put a hurdle in front of TAFE. Means we charge you for a TAFE degree. So we make it not very attractive, obviously, to take a TAFE degree. We all suffer a shortage of tradies. These tradies would actually build housing. They would build infrastructure. They're not there. So the few tradies that are out there are in high demand, which is why we're paying them very good money to do their job. Good on them, by the way. If you're a tradie, well done. You lucked out. Good stuff. But ultimately, we need more tradies. I'd say we should also restructure the way that we import people into Australia, meaning a couple of fewer international students, a couple more skilled visas, employee-sponsored skilled visas in the building trade, in the infrastructure sector, to play a bit of catch-up on the housing a bit faster than we do at the moment. That would be beneficial. And these would be then, of course, developments that drive housing prices down a tiny bit, which would benefit Gen Z a bit.
Talking about housing, you also suggested that manufactured and prefabricated housing could play a role in the future. We've been building our dwellings in Australia in much the same way for over a century. It hasn't changed. Productivity hasn't improved, has it?
No, it hasn't. And it's a bit of an embarrassment for the construction industry. If you say that you can't build more houses each year and that you can't build houses cheaper, this is not a great win. This is nothing to be overly proud of. Yes, ultimately our houses now are better than they were 50 years ago, a bit better insulated and so forth, but we haven't found ways to actually build housing smarter and faster. As a fast-growing country, that is a bit of an oversight, I would argue. So innovation there is definitely needed. And I'm a bit surprised that we hadn't seen at least one crazy billionaire around the world doubling down on housing construction. There's, of course, more that goes into housing costs than the price of building the box that you live in. But that element of the housing costs, that should go down and down and down. It's the same with infrastructure. It gets only more expensive to build infrastructure. Which is a bit worrisome, because ultimately, how much better is your sewage system now than it was 20 years ago?
Well, interestingly, a short while ago, I interviewed Tim Reardon, the chief economist of the HIA, for my other podcast, the Michael Yardley podcast, where their study showed that 50% of the cost of a new house in New South Wales, and a bit less in other states, was actually taxes at three levels: local government, state government, and federal government. So yes, it's more than just the cost of putting the box on it.
Yeah, and this is where we see the emphasis. Another tax story in Australia. The states in Australia are a bit different, but roughly speaking, again, just over 50% of the tax that the state earns are property-related taxes. So therefore, the states are also in cahoots with high house prices, because that's how they make their money. And if they wanted to really drive down house prices, they would need to find another source of revenue. So we're kind of caught in the system. And to make housing much cheaper at scale, to benefit our young Gen Zs that we're talking about today, we would need somebody who is willing to touch the system that we're operating in. And at the moment, if you looked at the discussions, especially at the last budget, if you're a bit of a policy wonk and you watch this, this was the single most embarrassing policy discussion that I've ever seen, where no major policies that get discussed. You just handed out a couple of goodies, pre-election budget, I guess. This is nonsense. Australia reached a couple of points where we stuck. And we do need systemic change rather than a bit of more money or something like this. No, we need to change the way we tax our people. We need to change the way we set up a housing system. That's difficult. I'm not mincing words here. This is a tough challenge. But so far, all the major politicians, both major parties, are absolutely shying away from any major reform. And that's one of the reasons why Gen Z should be a bit disheartened, even though we just looked at a couple of things that I'd say give them hope. But the hope needs to be seen in context of, well, more or less, we're happy to run the same system and kick the can further down the road.
Clearly, you put a lot of thought into this as you do in how demographics is going to shape our futures. And that's what you do at the demographics group. I'm going to leave a link in the show notes for people who would like to be in contact with you to help advise their organization, their business, their companies, or even at a government level. Maybe just a quick overview. What do you do and how do you help your clients?
Yeah, so at the demographics group, we always try to understand what the world of our clients, be this a consulting client, be this a um, an audience at a conference or in a boardroom, looks like through the demographic lens. We are really trying hard to show you your world from a new lens. And we then hope that this very much makes you a better business because you understand your customers, you understand your staff, you understand your market a bit better. There's much more, of course, that goes into running a successful business than just understanding the demographics, but self-serving narrative. I believe that adding the demographic perspective to your business well and truly helps you to understand your world a bit better.
Well, I'm sure you're right. Now, in your article in The Australian that led to me asking you to have a chat about this, you ended on a hopeful note. So let's say we were recording this podcast in 10 years' time in 2035. What do you hope Gen Z will say about the housing landscape and how things have changed for that over the decade that led up to 2035?
Well, I would hope that the Gen Z of 2035 says, it turns out it wasn't all that bad after all. Turns out I'm actually all right. Things went okay. I managed to start my family. I managed to get into a house. Yes, bit of a heavy lift, but it wasn't nearly as bad as I expected. That's the ultimate hope for Gen Z, is that they see that those big terrible news that they thought were going to kill them within 10 years, that they didn't eventuate. We talk about, yes, the planet probably kept warming when we look back from 2035. But ultimately, we managed to adjust. We managed to adapt our cities a bit to it. And so it is not pleasant, but it is manageable. And ultimately, I'm still at a desirable corner of the globe. So that's rather good to begin with. And maybe then, of course, Gen Zs in 10 years' time, they do have families, and you become more optimistic once you have a family, bizarrely enough, because you are just hopeful for those wonderful little humans.
Well, thanks for giving us this peek into the future, Simon. I think while Gen Zs may be feeling a bit downbeat today, what we've discussed shows that the next decade could bring them some welcome surprises, from rising wages to a structural shift in housing supply, and maybe even the government will be brave enough to have some reforms in education and tax policy. Look, of course, none of this is guaranteed, but if the trends you talked about do play out, we might look back at the 2020s as a time that, hey, it's a turning point, not only for our housing markets, but for restoring optimism in Australia's young adults. That's what I don't like, seeing that they're pessimistic. I think they don't have the context of where we are in Australia compared to the rest of the world, Simon. Boy, it could be a lot worse off, couldn't it?
Absolutely. And so all of those challenges that we are talking about in this podcast, we talk about an aging population, we talk about the disruption of global trade or something like this, we are relatively buffered from those developments. Many countries remain in terrible shape there. For example, one of the big benefits that we have is we are in full control of our borders.
Yes.
We take this as a given in Australia. Most of the continental countries don't have that at all. The idea of managing your border is such a big challenge. It's such a hope that these things are getting easier each year, and they don't, because the world will experience more what we call unmanaged population flows. So this is when people are being displaced through war and climate change and whatever it is. That'll increase rather than decrease. And we will not be flooded by these developments because we can be in control. We have treaties signed about how many refugees we take in if something goes wrong anywhere around the world and so forth. And we will probably, be nice and adhere to these treaties that we signed. But ultimately, these are small numbers compared to what most other countries will be dealing with. So again, once again, we are a lucky country. We are a desirable destination. And I don't see this change in the for
No, that won't change. So if you've enjoyed our chat today and you don't currently subscribe or follow this show, just click the follow or subscribe button on whatever app you're listening to this or watching this on so that you can get our insights every week. But also, if you know somebody, whether they're in Gen Z, your child, your grandchild, a mentee, please share this episode, or even for parents of Gen Zs, because it might give them some hope, and maybe, just maybe, the roadmap to their property futures will look a bit more positive for them. Simon, I look forward to catching up with you again next week.
Fantastic. I'll catch you next week, Michael.